The package took barely 30 seconds to hand over. 30 seconds that drained the color from the guard's face, pulled 3 sets of hands away from 3 holsters, and transformed a routine delivery run into a moment that Zariah Cole would spend the rest of her life measuring herself against. She felt the shift before she understood it. The air at the Kong mansion gate thickened and stilled, as if the iron fencing had leaned inward to close around her. She had barely released her grip on the parcel before the world stopped making sense. She stood there, unhurried and ordinary, her orange delivery jacket faded at the shoulders and her helmet dangling from 2 fingers at her side. She had every intention of getting a signature and leaving. She had a route to finish. But the guard who took the package didn't scan it, didn't reach for his clipboard, and didn't wave her back toward the street. He stared at what his colleague had just found beneath the brown paper wrapping, and then he stared at her. Inside the mansion at the end of the stone driveway, Kong Taemak sat alone at the head of a long mahogany table. Salt and pepper hair, dark suit, hands that had built and buried more than the city would ever know, resting still against the polished wood. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice because his silence had already decided things. His presence filled the grand room without effort, the decanter of whiskey untouched beside him, the warm chandelier light doing nothing to soften the weight of his expression. The guards brought Zariah inside. They placed the letter, unsealed, handwritten, trembling slightly in the hands that carried it, on the table before him. Kong Taemak read it once. Then he read it again. And in the amber stillness of his own empire, the man who had not flinched in 40 years of absolute power pressed his hand flat against the page, closed his eyes, and wept. The guards looked at the floor. Zariah, standing in the corridor beyond the heavy door, heard it through the wood, a sound so raw and private it felt like a crime to witness. She hadn't known what was hidden inside that package. She had only promised a vanished young man, 7 years ago, that she would one day deliver it. She had kept her word. She had not known it would shatter the most feared man in Seoul. Zariah Cole had a system. She knew every shortcut, every red light that ran long, every security booth where the guards waved her through without checking her manifest because they had seen her face 5 days a week for the past 2 years. She knew which buildings had elevators that smelled of cigarettes and which staircases were faster. She knew, with the quiet precision of someone who had learned the city through its back doors and service entrances, exactly how invisible a woman on a delivery bike could be. And she had made that invisibility into a kind of art. Her route through the Mapo district took her past the Kong mansion every Tuesday and Thursday, without fail. It sat at the end of a road that the rest of the neighborhood seemed to exhale around. A long, iron-gated estate behind walls of pale stone, surrounded by prune trees that blocked the upper floors from street view. She had never seen the gate open. She had never needed to. Every package for that district turned left 2 blocks before it, into the commercial corridor of restaurants and boutiques that served the people who lived near power rather than inside it. The mansion simply existed at the edge of her world like a closed chapter, present, heavy, none of her concern. She had learned not to look at it too long. That Tuesday morning began the same as every other. She arrived at the depot on World Cup Row before 7, signed her manifest, loaded the rear panniers of her bike, and poured the last of the communal coffee into a paper cup that she finished standing up. The depot was loud and fluorescent and smelled of cardboard and diesel, and she moved through it with the ease of someone who had long since stopped noticing. Her supervisor, a compact man named Day One, who communicated primarily through clipboard gestures, handed her the day's final package without looking up. Late edition, he said. Priority. She looked at the address. The street name alone made something in her chest go quiet. The dispatch form had her name printed on it. Not handwritten, not a reassignment, but typed deliberate, as though whoever had filed the order had done so knowing exactly which driver to request. She turned the package over in her hands. Brown paper, sealed cleanly, the weight of something small and dense and carefully placed. No company logo, no return address, just her name on the form and the Kong Estates gate number at the end of that long, exhaled road. She stood in the depot for a moment longer than she should have, the noise of the morning moving around her like a current she had stepped out of. She thought about Se-hyun, the particular way his hands had shaken the last night she saw him, and the phrase he had made her repeat back until she had it perfectly, and the way he'd said, "You'll know when," as though he already understood how this would go. She clipped her helmet, mounted her bike, and turned toward the road she had never taken. She had never asked Se-hyun what his father did. That was, she understood now, the foundation of the entire friendship. In a city where people read each other for status and utility within the first 30 seconds of conversation, her simple failure to ask had been, to him, an extraordinary act of grace. He had knocked on her door 2 weeks after moving in upstairs, holding a bag of tangerines and wearing the expression of someone who had rehearsed the gesture 3 times before committing to it. He said he had bought too many. She said she liked tangerines. They had stood in her doorway talking for 40 minutes before either of them thought to introduce themselves properly. After that, it was easy the way only uncomplicated things are, the kind of friendship that lives in small, repeated moments rather than grand declarations. He brought food when he cooked too much, which was often. She knocked on his door when her internet went out, which was also often. He watched films with the subtitles on even in Korean, and she never asked why. She played her music at a volume that drifted up through his floorboards, and he never once complained. He had a way of sitting in her kitchen that suggested he was resting from something heavy and ongoing, though he never named what it was. She had learned not to pull at threads she hadn't been offered. She noticed the things he couldn't hide. The way he checked the street from her window when he thought she wasn't watching. The phone he kept on silent, but never let leave his hand. The reflex, so fast it was almost nothing, of stepping back from windows in lit rooms after dark. She filed these things quietly and asked about none of them. That was the agreement. They had never spoken aloud. The night before he disappeared, he came to her door at 11:30. He was dressed as if he'd been somewhere formal, but his collar was open and his face was the face of someone who had already made a decision and was now living in its shadow. He sat at her kitchen table without being asked and set an envelope down beside her fruit bowl. His hands, she noticed, did not stop moving, fingers pressing flat, then curling, then pressing flat again. He told her it was a letter for his father. He told her his father's name and the address, and that she would need to deliver it in person because any other method would mean it never arrived at all. He told her there would come a moment. She would know it when it came, when she might need to prove she knew him, truly knew him, in a way no stranger could fabricate. Then he taught her the phrase, a memory from his childhood, a specific morning, a specific kitchen, a detail so private it could only have come from Son. He made her repeat it until it was clean and exact. At the door, he held her gaze for a moment too long. "Thank you," he said, "for never asking." Then he was gone. The gate did not open when she rang. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then a panel in the stone pillar slid back, and a face appeared behind reinforced glass. A man whose age was difficult to place and whose expression was not. He looked at her the way people look at things that have arrived in the wrong place. His gaze moved from her helmet to her jacket to the package under her arm with a slowness that was itself a kind of threat. "Delivery," Zariah said. She held up the manifest. He didn't take it. He spoke into a radio instead, his eyes never leaving her. And within 90 seconds there were 2 more men at the gate. Suits, earpieces, the particular stillness of people trained to stand between danger and something precious. One of them opened the gate just wide enough to pull her through by the arm. Not roughly, but without the suggestion that she had any choice in the matter. Her bike was left on the street outside. The gate closed behind her with a sound like a held breath releasing. They searched the package in the guardhouse with the focused efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times. When they found the envelope tucked beneath the brown paper wrapping, unsealed, handwritten, addressed simply to Father, the dynamic in the small room changed. The senior guard held it by its edges and studied the handwriting with an expression Zariah could not fully read. Then he spoke into his radio again, lower this time, and the word he used made the other men straighten almost imperceptibly. She was walked to the mansion's side entrance and into a corridor of pale marble that swallowed sound. They did not return the letter. They did not explain. They placed her in the corridor like a piece of furniture they hadn't decided where to put yet and told her, without warmth, to wait. A guard remained at each end of the hallway. The envelope disappeared through a set of heavy double doors at the far end, carried by a man who knocked once, received a single word in response, and slipped inside. The doors closed. Zariah stood in the marble quiet and breathed carefully. The corridor was immaculate. A console table, a vase of white flowers, a painting of mountains she didn't recognize. Everything in it was chosen to project control. She focused on the flowers and waited. She heard it after perhaps 4 minutes. It was not a loud sound. It was the kind of sound that reaches you precisely because everything around it is so completely still. A single fractured exhale, then another, and then something low and sustained that the marble walls carried with terrible clarity. It was the sound of a man weeping in a room built specifically to be impenetrable. The guard to her left did not move, but his eyes dropped to the floor. The guard to her right looked straight ahead and swallowed once. And Zariah stood between them in the white silence, holding Sehyun's coded phrase inside her chest like a coal, understanding for the first time the full weight of what she had carried through that gate. The doors opened without warning. Kong Taemak filled the frame the way certain men fill a room, not through size alone, though he was broad and unhurried in the way of someone who had never needed to rush toward anything, because everything had always come to him. It was something in the arrangement of his stillness. The salt and pepper hair was immaculate. The dark suit carried no wrinkle, no concession to the previous 4 minutes. The only evidence that anything had occurred behind those doors was the faint redness at the lower rims of his eyes, which he wore as though daring her to mention it. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Walk with me," and turned before she could respond. She walked with him. He took her to a sitting room off the main corridor. Not the study, she noticed, not the room where the letter had gone. A neutral space. 2 chairs arranged across from each other with a low table between them. A decanter untouched on the sideboard. Morning light pressing through curtains that were almost but not fully open. He sat. He gestured for her to do the same. He set the letter on the table between them, face down, with the deliberate placement of a man who needed it within reach, but could not look at it again yet. "Where is he?" The question arrived with no preamble, no softening. "I don't know," Zariah said. "He didn't tell me where he was going. Only what I was supposed to do before he left." "Who sent you?" "He did. Sejun. About 8 months ago, before he disappeared." "Who do you work for?" "A depot on World Cup Row. I'm a delivery driver." She held his gaze. That's the whole answer. Taemak's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A subtle recalibration, the look of a man updating a calculation he had already run. His eyes moved over her with the patience of someone who had spent decades reading people for survival, searching for the seam in a story, the place where the stitching showed. "How did you know him?" "He lived in my building, 2 floors up. We were neighbors for almost 2 years. And in those 2 years, what did he tell you about his family?" "Nothing," Zariah said. "He never mentioned you." "Not once." Something crossed Taemak's face at that. Too fast an aim, gone before it could be measured. She pressed forward carefully. He ate ramen at midnight when he couldn't sleep, which was most nights. He kept a plant on his windowsill that he forgot to water and then felt genuinely guilty about. He cried at the end of a film once and laughed at himself for it afterward. She paused. He folded his delivery boxes flat, before putting them in recycling because he said his mother had taught him not to waste space. The muscle in Tamok's jaw tightened. He did not speak for a long moment. He looked at the letter on the table between them and then back at her, and his eyes held something that was not yet trust but was no longer entirely suspicion. "You'll stay," he said finally. It was not a question. She had not noticed him during the interrogation. That, she realized afterward, was entirely by design. Ryu Hyunjae had positioned himself at the periphery of the sitting room with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years making himself part of the architecture, present enough to hear everything, removed enough to be overlooked. He was lean and fine-featured, dressed in a suit that was quieter than the other men's, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked, at first reading, like legal counsel. Soraya had taken him for an advisor, a secretary, something administrative. She understood her mistake only when he spoke. "Miss Cole." She had been walking back toward the marble corridor, following a guard to what she understood was a room where she would wait again, when his voice arrived from just behind her left shoulder, close enough to be intimate, measured enough to carry its own warning. She turned. He was already beside her, matching her pace without appearing to hurry, steering her with proximity rather than touch toward a narrower hallway that branched away from the main corridor. The guard ahead of her continued, walking without looking back. "You've had quite a morning," Hyunjae said pleasantly. "I hope the men at the gate weren't too rough with you." "I'm fine," Soraya said. "Good." He smiled. It was a perfectly constructed smile, warm at the surface, with nothing underneath it. The chairman is a man with a great deal on his mind. He can become absorbed in situations that may not warrant his full attention. It falls to those of us who manage the day-to-day to ensure he isn't burdened unnecessarily. Soraya said nothing. "Your bike is at the front gate," Hyunjae continued, his tone unchanged, the way a temperature that is wrong can hold itself steady. "I've had your packages brought up from the panniers. Your depot will mark the rest of the route as completed. We'll make sure of that. A car can take you back to Mapo." A brief pause, smooth as a page turning. "It's really the most sensible arrangement. For everyone." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He looked at her with the patient, courteous expression of a man who is accustomed to people understanding him correctly on the first attempt. "Thank you for the delivery, Miss Cole," he said. "Safe travels." She found Tamok in the corridor outside the sitting room, speaking quietly to one of his guards. She walked toward him with a directness she did not entirely feel, and when he turned to look at her, his expression asked the question before he could. "A man named Ryu Hyunjae just told me my bike is at the front gate," she said. "That my packages have been removed from the panniers. That a car is ready to take me back to Mapo." She kept her voice level. "He said it was the most sensible arrangement. For everyone." She watched Tamok's face with the attention Se-hyun had never known she'd learned from him. The stillness that moved through the boss was not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a man confirming something he had already begun to suspect, colder than anger, and considerably more dangerous. His eyes settled on hers with a new quality of focus. "You came back to tell me that," he said quietly. "You told me to stay," Soraya replied. The house changed after dark. The staff moved differently, quieter, more peripheral, as though the mansion itself exhaled at nightfall, and everyone inside had adjusted to the new pressure. Soraya had been given a room that afternoon without ceremony, a spare room off a secondary corridor, plain by the estate's standards and more comfortable than anywhere she had slept in recent memory. She had not been told she could leave. She had not been told she couldn't. She sat on the edge of the bed for an hour, listening to the buildings settle around her, and then a knock came, a single, unhurried rap, and a young attendant told her the chairman would see her now. The study was at the end of the east corridor, behind the double doors she recognized from the morning. They were open this time. It was a large room made to feel smaller by what it contained. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of bound documents and books, a desk of dark polished wood, a lamp casting a circle of amber light across its surface. The whiskey decanter sat where she had somehow already imagined it, the level slightly lower than it had been when the day began. And on the corner of the desk, angled slightly toward the chair behind it, a framed photograph. She recognized Se-hyun before she recognized anything else about the image. The particular set of his shoulders, the way he held his own hands even as a child, slightly uncertain, as though unsure what to do with them. He was perhaps 9 or 10, standing in a garden she didn't know, squinting against bright sunlight. Beside him, a younger Taemak, not yet carved into the man he had become, still carrying something in his face that the years had since removed. He was looking at the camera. The boy was looking at him. Taemak was already seated. He gestured to the chair across the desk without preamble, and she sat, and for a moment neither of them acknowledged the photograph. Then he said, "Did he eat properly?" The question arrived so quietly, so entirely stripped of the interrogation's cold architecture, that it took her a half-second to adjust. "Not always," she said honestly. "He cooked well when he made the effort, but when he was tired or low, it was ramen and whatever the convenience store had." Taemak absorbed this without expression. Did he laugh easily? Sometimes. When something genuinely caught him off guard, yes. He had a laugh he seemed almost embarrassed by, like it came out bigger than he intended. A long pause. Was he happy? Zariah held the question carefully before answering, because it deserved that. He was getting there, she said. He had hard stretches. He flinched when people raised their voices, even in films, even when it wasn't real. She kept her eyes on Taemak's face. He slept with the lights on for the entire first year we were neighbors. He never explained it, and I never asked. Taemak's hand, resting on the desk, closed slowly into a loose fist. He never spoke about you by name, Zariah continued, because she had decided on the drive up from Apo that if she was ever in this room, she would not flinch either. But sometimes, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, he would go quiet for a moment, just a few seconds, and then come back. Every time, it was the same silence. She paused. I think it had the shape of you. The amber light held steady between them. Taemak looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking, and Zariah let the silence stand, because some truths need a moment of open air before they can be survived. She had not planned to say it that night. She had told herself, in the plain room off the secondary corridor, that her role was narrow. Carry the letter, answer the questions, hold the phrase in reserve. She was a messenger, not a confessor. The rest of it belonged to Se-hyun, to whatever future conversation a father and son might eventually find their way toward. It was not hers to give. But Taemak was looking at the photograph with an expression she recognized, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been strong for so long that they have forgotten what they were being strong for. And she thought of Se-hyun at her kitchen table, hands pressing flat and then curling, and she understood that Se-hyun had not simply asked her to deliver a letter. He had asked her to deliver the truth the letter could only begin. He didn't leave because he stopped loving you, she said. Taemak's gaze moved from the photograph to her face. He left because he didn't know how to keep loving you from inside this. She said it without gesture, without drama, letting the words carry their own weight. He told me once, not about you specifically, he never named it, but he said that some environments make feeling things a liability. That after long enough, you start performing numbness just to get through the day. And then one morning you wake up and you can't find a place where the performance ends. She paused. He was 23 when he left. He was already tired in the way that takes years to accumulate. The room was very still. He grieved you, Zariah continued. That's what I want you to understand. He wasn't angry. He was heartsick. There's a difference, and it matters, because anger eventually burns through itself. But grief means you still love the thing you lost. He left because staying was making him disappear, and he couldn't bear to disappear while you were still in the same city and didn't notice. She watched it, the small, sustained effort of a man holding his own face together through will alone. His hands, which had been resting flat on the desk with the deliberate steadiness she was coming to recognize as his default armor, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. He did not speak for a long time. The decanter caught the lamplight. The photograph stood at its angle on the corner of the desk, the boy looking up at the man looking elsewhere. Zariah did not fill the silence. She had said what needed saying, and she let it settle into him at whatever depth it needed to reach. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the last of its executive register. It was quieter than she had yet heard it, stripped of architecture, of the cold precision he had worn through the morning's interrogation and the evening's careful questions about Ramian and laughter and light. Was he afraid of me? She did not look away. Yes, she said gently. And he loved you anyway. That's what the letter is. She should have anticipated it would happen at night. In the hours after she left the study, the mansion had resumed its performance of normalcy. Doors closed, staff moved through their routines, and Zariah had returned to her room and sat with the specific alertness of someone whose body understood a threat their mind was still assembling. She thought about Hyunjae's smile, the way it had held its shape independent of anything behind it. She thought about the guard who had continued walking without looking back, and the hallway he had steered her into, and the word sensible deployed like a blade wrapped in linen. She was almost asleep when a knock came. A woman this time, an attendant she hadn't seen before, with a professionally pleasant expression and a brief, clear explanation. The chairman had arranged for her to be taken home for the night. Her things were already at the front entrance. A car was waiting. Zariah dressed without hurrying, thinking carefully. Taemak had said nothing about this when she left the study. He had said very little at all after her final answer, had simply sat with it, the question and its response, as though he needed both hands free to hold what she had given him. He had not mentioned a car. She collected her jacket from the chair and followed the attendant. The car was black and large and sat idling at the base of the front steps, a driver at the wheel and no one else visible. Her delivery bag had been placed on the back seat with a neatness that felt performative. She got in. The gate opened. The car pulled smoothly into the dark of the private road, and she watched the mansion's lit windows recede through the rear glass and counted seconds the way Se-hyun had taught her, without knowing he was teaching her. Some environments make feeling things a liability. You start performing calm just to get through it. And by the time she reached 120, she knew with complete certainty that they were not heading toward Mapo. The streets outside were unfamiliar. The driver had not spoken. She had no signal on her phone. She had no weapon, no leverage, nothing except the things Se-hyun had pressed in her memory on a night that had felt, at the time, like an excess of caution. She understood now that he had known his father's house better than anyone. She leaned forward in her seat, her voice even and unhurried, and she spoke the phrase into the silence of the car. The specific memory, the private mourning, the detail that could only have come from a boy who had once sat in his father's kitchen and been, briefly, simply a child. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. Not the reaction of a man who hadn't heard it. The reaction of a man who recognized exactly what it meant and understood. Immediately, the weight of his next decision. His hand moved to the radio. She sat back and breathed and waited. In the study, Taemak received the message. Those nearest to him in the corridor outside said afterward that they had never seen him move like that. Coat abandoned on the chair, no instruction given, no pause to issue commands. He was simply, suddenly, in motion, with the focused velocity of a man who has just understood what he stands to lose and has decided at long last that he will not lose it quietly. The car stopped at an intersection 3 blocks from the estate. Not because of traffic, because 2 black vehicles had positioned themselves across the road with the unhurried precision of people who had been given coordinates in advance. And the driver of Zariah's car made the calculation that reasonable men make when the alternative is unreasonable and pulled to the curb without being asked. Zariah watched through the window. Hyunjae was already there, standing between the two vehicles with his hands clasped in front of him, his coat perfectly arranged against the night air. He had the bearing of a man who had planned for several contingencies and was comfortable with all of them. Behind him, for others, still attentive position rather than clustered. It had the geometry of an ambush that wanted to be mistaken for an escort. Then Taemak's car arrived. He was out of it before it fully stopped, and the quality of his movement silenced everything in the street. Not because it was violent, but because it was entirely without hesitation, and men like Hyunjae build their confidence on the assumption that powerful people pause before acting. Taemak did not pause. He crossed the distance between his car and Hyunjae with the directness of someone who had already conducted the entire conversation in his head and needed only to deliver its conclusion. He stopped close enough that lowering his voice was a choice, not a necessity. Zariah could not hear the words. She watched them move through Hyunjae's face, watched the composed, pleasant architecture of the man begin to shift in increments. Not dramatically. It was not the collapse of a facade so much as the slow pressurization of something sealed too long. Taemak did not raise his hands, did not gesture toward the man behind him. He simply spoke with the steady, conclusive weight of a man who has been the final word in every room he has entered for 30 years and knows, with complete precision, how to use that. The lieutenants at the perimeter watched without moving. When Taemak finished, Hyunjae stood very still for a moment that stretched beyond comfort. Then he nodded once with the mechanical quality of a man operating on reflex because genuine response was no longer available to him. He stepped aside. His men stepped aside with him. No signal was given. No order was issued. They simply receded from the geometry they had created, and the street opened, and it was over. No blood. No raised voice that Zariah could detect. Nothing that the city around them would remember in the morning. Somehow it was the most frightening thing she had witnessed since the gate closed behind her the previous morning. Taemak turned from Hyunjae without a final look, the most complete form of dismissal, and walked toward her car. His driver opened the rear door, and he bent and looked at her through it, and his face in the ambient light of the street held something she hadn't seen on it before. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. The expression of a man who has just made an irreversible decision and found, on the other side of it, that he can breathe. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded, and something in him settled. He straightened and looked back once. Not at Hyunjae, but at the direction of the estate, at the world he had just definitively altered, with the gaze of a man taking leave of something he had outgrown without knowing it, until tonight. Then he looked back at Zariah. "I need you to help me reach my son," he said quietly. She held his gaze in the dark of the open door. This man who had spent a morning reading her for lies and an evening learning to sit with truth, and she thought of Se-hyun at her kitchen table, hands pressing flat, asking her to carry something heavier than she knew. "I know," she said. "That's why he sent me." She did not ask how Se-hyun would be found. She suspected that a man who had built an empire on information had always known, on some level, where his son was, that the not knowing had been a choice, a form of pride dressed as restraint. What had changed was not the ability to reach him. What had changed was what Taemak was willing to say when he did. He told her this in the car on the way back to the estate, with the directness of a man who had spent an evening learning that plainness was not weakness. He did not want Se-hyun summoned. He did not want him presented with an expectation or a role or the implicit pressure of an inheritance waiting to be claimed. He wanted, for the first time in 7 years, to simply ask his son to come home. Not to the organization, not to the name, but to the room at the end of the East Corridor, where a photograph had sat on the corner of a desk through all the years of silence, angled toward an empty chair. "Tell him I'm not asking him to forgive the past," Taemak said, looking straight ahead through the windscreen at the dark road. Tell him I'm asking for the chance to be worth forgiving. In whatever time we have left. Zoraya carried the message the way she had carried everything Se-hyun had ever given her, carefully, without addition or subtraction, in the exact words she had been handed. She did not know what Se-hyun said in the moment he received it. She was not there. She had passed the message through the channel he had established before he disappeared, the one she had never asked about and he had never explained, and then she had waited in the ordinary way of someone who has done what they could and must now trust the rest of the people it belongs to. He came on a Thursday, 12 days after the letter. She knew because Tamok's attendant called her, not to report, simply to tell her, in the brief and careful way of someone delivering something they understood was significant, that the chairman's son had arrived that morning and that they were together in the main room. She went to the estate one final time to collect her bike from the gatehouse, where it had been stored with a care that suggested someone had given specific instructions about it. The attendant at the gate handed her the handlebar with a small bow. She checked the panniers from habit. They were empty and clean. Through the tall windows of the main room, at an angle in a distance that gave her only a sliver of the interior, she could see the long table, the warm light above it, 2 glasses of whiskey on the polished wood, and 2 figures seated across from each other, one broad and still, one younger, leaning forward slightly with his elbows on the table in the way she recognized from 1,000 evenings in her kitchen. She did not stop to watch. It was not hers to watch. She clipped her helmet, mounted the bike, and rode toward the gate as it opened. The city spread ahead of her in the early morning light, wide and indifferent and full of the ordinary noise of people moving through their lives, and she moved into it the way she always had, efficiently and without ceremony, carrying nothing now but herself. The gate closed behind her, the weight she had carried for a vanished friend, across 2 years and one impossible morning in a corridor of marble silence, lifted from her shoulders so gradually and so completely that she was 3 blocks away before she noticed it was gone. She rode on. The city opened. The light was good.